The SEC is less than 2 weeks away from Texas and Oklahoma officially being part of the conference. That will put the SEC at 16 members. But how long can we expect the SEC to stay at 16 before it expands again? Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams, and the expansion realignment carousel, it's been paused for about a year, ever since the demise of the Pac-12 last summer, the further expansion of the Big Ten. But expansion was back in the conversation a few weeks ago at SEC spring meetings when I asked Greg Sankey, in effect, when would the SEC expand again? And Sankey noted that there are media rights agreements with other conferences that prevent a lot of movement right now. But how long can we expect those schools to stay in place? That's what I'm wondering. John, I'm wondering if that's what you're wondering whenever you hear Greg Sankey say things like, quote, I pay attention, noting that he's paying attention to the landscape out there and saying he's content with 16 teams. But do you think that's really the case? Is the SEC content at 16?
He's very articulative, but he also can be very vague, which is kind of what you have to do in his position. Articulate effectively, but don't say a whole lot. Football coaches could learn from him. I think if you go back to, remember Texas and Oklahoma, how that just came out. That was like a northeaster roaring through the land. It just came out of nowhere. It was like all of a sudden, what? A nary a hint of that prior to it about expansion, and then the biggest expansion of all for the SEC, because while it had added other programs, none of the magnitude of Texas and Oklahoma. So that came out of nowhere. So I think the next time this happens, I think it again will kind of be blindsided by it. There will be very little discussion or speculation leading right up to it, and then boom, 2 more teams or 4 more teams.
Yeah, and I think the Sankey quote to note from spring meetings was when he said, quote, we respect that there are agreements and situations that prevent a lot of movement, so our focus has been on our 16, end quote. Now, what he's not saying specifically there, but I think is alluding to, is the situation in the ACC. Up to this point, the ACC has been spared from this round of realignment. Now, they added a few schools. They added SMU, they added Cal and Stanford. Figure that out, right? From the the leftovers, the scraps from the Pac-12, Cal and Stanford are among those joining the ACC. But it hasn't lost any schools, and part of the reason for that is there is a grant of rights agreement that is ongoing through 2036 that has glued that membership together. Even members like a Florida State that, if it had its druthers, would probably prefer to get out of there and start shopping for a new conference. But that hasn't happened in the ACC because of that ongoing grant of rights agreements. By comparison, the Big 12 and the Pac-12 had expiring grant of rights agreements. So the SEC and the Big Ten went on a sweepstakes there and did their shopping and cherry-picked the best schools out of those conferences. So my perspective, John, is that the next time the SEC expands, assuming it happens, assuming that at some point they grow bigger than 16, it's going to come from the ACC. Because the way I see it, if they wanted anybody else from the Big 12, they would have got them in this last batch when they nabbed Oklahoma and Texas. And if they wanted anybody from the Pac-12, they could have got involved in that sweepstakes as well. They never really were interested at all in the Pac-12. And so the fact that they left all those other schools alone, and then reading into what Sankey's saying here about these agreements in other conferences, I think he's specifically, without saying it outright, pointing toward the ACC. And that's where I look for the SEC at some point to maybe turn its attention if those schools become available. Is that where you see the next natural path of expansion for the SEC? Or do you think it's possible that the SEC just stays at 16 long term?
Well, it's almost as though the SEC and Big Ten are in a kind of a class of their own now in terms of acquiring other schools. I think the Big 12 has rebounded nicely from its losses of Texas and Oklahoma, and is being aggressive in other ways, trying to be innovative and to stay relevant. But I still think we look to the Big Ten and the SEC as the teams more apt to acquire schools. So I agree with what you're saying. Whereas I might like to see some other teams from the Big 12. I don't think the SEC is going in that direction. The ACC also is nearby, and then, but just because it's nearby and geographically feasible, that doesn't mean it can't ignore the fact that some of those schools could end up not in the SEC but the Big Ten.
Yeah, the Big Ten has showed that it'll add anybody from
Yeah.
coast to coast. It expands, from Los Angeles to Piscataway, New Jersey with Rutgers. It extends from Maryland up to Seattle, Washington, and Oregon. So, yeah, I mean, they go coast to coast. The one area where the Big Ten has not been able to penetrate is the South. That's, the South and Southwest are part of the country that they really haven't gotten a foothold. If some of these AC schools should become available maybe years down the road, like a Florida State, like a Clemson, how damaging do you think it would be to the SEC if a brand like that, like an FSU, like a Clemson, a school in the South with a prominent football program, if one of those schools would end up in the Big Ten? Do you think that's kind of shrug of the shoulders, big deal, doesn't matter that much, or would that be potentially damaging to the SEC if the Big Ten came in and swooped one of those brands?
Damaging more to its ego, I think.
Hmm.
Uh, I think that the SEC is really well set with 16 teams. Now, if it could trade programs and remove schools and add some from the ACC, it could be a more powerful conference in football. That's what everybody looks at when we talk expansion. But right now, when the SEC added Oklahoma and Texas, to me, it became a super conference. You've added the very best from a very good conference, the Big 12, and so I don't know if the Big Ten can top that, even if it gets programs out of the ACC. However, the SEC doesn't like to lose. It's a highly competitive game. Speaking of expansion, and so I think if it thought Florida State were going to the Big Ten, or North Carolina were going to the Big Ten, it might say, "Whoa, you need to talk to us first. Let's do some comparison shoppings." I don't think it would just ignore it. I think the SEC is so strong and so well set up now, it doesn't have to have anybody else. It can acquire schools by choice, not out of necessity.
Yeah, I totally agree, John. And this differs from at least one of the past expansions. I mean, when the SEC went from 10 to 12, it wanted to split into divisions so it could conduct a conference championship game in football, a big trendsetter, something that brought more revenue into the conference. I mean, that was, sort of by necessity an expansion. If you wanted to have a football championship at that time, you had to be in divisions, which meant you had to have at least 12 teams. And so that's what the SEC did. It added Arkansas and South Carolina, got to 12. FSU at that time very famously went ACC rather than SEC. Bobby Bowden said outright he thought that the football program had a better path to success in the ACC than the SEC, and the SEC wound up with South Carolina and Arkansas. But to your point, I think this time around, and maybe even in past expansions, the SEC comes at this from a position of ultimate strength. They can add someone if they want to. They certainly don't have to. There's not a number that they're chasing. I think there might be some brands they'd be interested in from the ACC if they became available, but they're not chasing a number. And in fact, I've written, John, that I think if the ACC's grant of rights crumbled, and currently Florida State and Clemson are in ongoing lawsuits against the ACC. So, I mean, this is college sports in 2024, right? The courts will have a say on this matter in the end. But if there's some fissures in that conference, I think there are 4 schools that the SEC may have some level of interest in. I think North Carolina would be a prize at the top of the list. Big brand, growing state, extends the SEC's footprint in the South, which it has liked doing in past expansions. Geography, culture, identity matter more to SEC expansion than it does to the Big Ten. So I think North Carolina would be at the top of the list for the SEC's wish list. And then I think the other three they would have some level of interest in are Florida State, Clemson, and Virginia. Now, Virginia is one that I know when I've written these columns, that surprises some of my readers. They think, Virginia, why would you want Virginia? And from a football sense, I get it. Virginia doesn't move the needle like these other schools we're talking about. But if we've looked at past SEC expansions, again, they've looked for schools that fit their Southern identity, their culture, that adds a neighboring state to gradually expand the footprint. And I do think the SEC, even though football drives the bus of realignment, I think the SEC does like to add athletic departments that top to bottom are pretty strong. And Virginia, while it may lag behind those other schools that I mentioned in football, its overall athletic department is pretty good. There's really not a lot you can pick at there other than football. So I want to get to maybe our proposed schools here in a moment. But before we go there, what are your thoughts on these four schools that I've put forward as candidates for possible further expansion for the SEC, schools they might become interested in if that grant of rights fractures in the ACC?
Well, see, when I look at expansion, I look at it completely different. I'm not looking at how many more viewers this might add, what market it might add. I'm just looking at what's the best fit and what school might add the most in terms of competition. That's what I look at it. I'm interested in the competition. Will these games be better if I'm watching this school play? That's why I wouldn't be shy about ejecting members from the SEC and replacing them with more formidable programs. But yeah, I can understand all of your four picks there. Clemson and Florida State, to me, just stick out for the reason I said. They have other advantages, and they're good in other sports, but they're football driven, and they seem like SEC schools. If you went, I've covered a game at Florida State. I haven't covered a game at Clemson, but I've covered games involving Clemson. I've been around the fan bases. I think of those as SEC fan bases. I guess that's a barometer I use. If you put these fans in with a bunch of SEC fans, could you tell much difference? I don't think so. But it does have a great it has a good sports program overall. I would probably look at it and probably prefer NC State to Virginia. NC State has a really good it's in the College World Series, right? It just was eliminated, but it made the College World Series. It was good in women's basketball this year. It's been pretty good in football. Not at the same level of Florida State and Clemson, but it's been okay. I mean, it can win 8 games. It would come in, and you don't think of it as contending for a championship in the SEC, but it could go in the middle, not necessarily at the bottom. So, and another thing we have to keep in mind, if you come into the SEC, that increases your opportunities for success in football. Yes, the competition's more difficult, but it also affects your recruiting. There's no doubt about that. When you're recruiting to an SEC school, it's the best conference in football, and I think that enhances your chances with recruits. So, in North Carolina, it's had some success in football. It's known as a basketball school, of course, but it's good in other sports as well. So that's probably what I would like. And I would like having North Carolina and NC State. I like maintaining as many rivalries as you can. And though Virginia's been in the same conference, it's not the same as NC State versus UNC.
So if I forced you to get to 20, John, adding 4 schools from the ACC, I know, previously you said you kind of like the idea of Oklahoma State or maybe someone else in the Big 12, but let's put that aside. If I said you have to get to 20 for the SEC, and you have to do it from the ACC. You would add Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, and NC State would be your fourth. That's what you're saying. That four pack there.
Yes, and you're saying Virginia now. If what could we come up with a compromise candidate if we both could? We agree on three schools. So if we're making this decision, and I say, well, I'm not budging off NC State, and you say I love Virginia and I'm sticking with the Cavaliers, could we come up with another school that we could both agree on as a
Well, I don't love the
compromise
Cavaliers.
candidate?
Yeah, to be clear, John, I don't love the Cavaliers that much. I'm telling
Oh,
you, I think Virginia would interest the SEC.
okay,
I don't know
okay,
that they interest me that much. I think they would
okay. Well,
interest the SEC. So my compromise candidate, I thought about NC State. I don't hate the idea. And I think North Carolina, Clemson, and Florida State, we're in lockstep on that. Those three make sense. And I've gone different ways on this. At one time, I even tried to force myself to think Pittsburgh could be that 20th school, because in terms of culture, like, Pittsburgh, I mean, there are some things about it that's a little bit Southern. I mean, it's a steel city. It's a football city, more the Steelers than college football, but it is a football city. Sometimes people think Pennsylvania is the Northeast. There's nothing about Pittsburgh that's Northeast. You lived there, you know that. To me, it's much more Rust Belt or Southern. I mean, they call Birmingham the Pittsburgh of the South. So,
yeah.
yeah. At one time, I tried to convince myself to go Pittsburgh, but I'm now on a different train of thought, and I'm not going Miami, not going Louisville. I'm not inviting Georgia Tech back. They had their chance. They were in the SEC at one time. They're gone. Virginia Tech, I'm not going with them either, even though I love their football atmosphere, playing Metallica at the beginning of the game. I like that. I'm going with Duke. That's where I've landed now. I know it's a basketball school and this is a football conference, but if you're going to get North Carolina, I mean, the SEC dominates so many of these other sports. Basketball is the missing piece. And the SEC hasn't produced a men's basketball champion since 2012, Kentucky. They're in this drought. Greg Sankey has been very intentional about trying to elevate the conference in men's basketball. And on many fronts, he succeeded. But national championships in men's hoops have remained elusive during the commissioner's tenure. I think that's sort of the missing piece sport still for the SEC, even though it's better. And you talked about maintaining rivalries. I think that's appealing to me. And so if you could keep that UNC Duke basketball rivalry together in the same conference, I mean, I'm lukewarm on all these other candidates we're talking about. So the heck with it. Let's just take the basketball blue blood that's out there, and you're getting two good football programs in Clemson, Florida State. North Carolina is good in a variety of sports. Go ahead and just take Duke, get the men's basketball program. Women's basketball program is pretty solid too. That's where I'm landing right now, although who knows, maybe next week I'll be back on Pittsburgh or something.
Yeah. Well, that would improve the medical care in the conference.
There you go.
That would be a side advantage to it. Yeah, I just again though, I still think of football as the thing, and it would help in basketball certainly, and I do like the rivalry, but boy, Duke football.
What about last year, though, John? I mean, Duke was pretty. I know they lost their coach. Mike Elko's now at Texas A&M, but we saw Duke last year go 8-5. They beat Clemson in the season opener at home. There was a pretty good environment for that game. They gave Notre Dame all they could handle. They beat NC State at home. I mean, there's been moments. It hasn't lasted. They haven't sustained it, but there's been moments where Duke football has been respectable. Not great, not a college football playoff team, but they've had moments of respectability, more so than, say, like a Vanderbilt, another smart school that really hasn't had too many respectable moments in football. Duke's done it a little bit better. So is that enough? Could I just say, like, well, they could go 6-6 in football some years, and then, you get them in basketball. Still not enough to sweeten the pot for you, huh?
No, because I think about it, they've had moments of success, but I'm thinking about those other moments when they have a Vanderbilt, and keep in mind, there's that potential. They can have a Vanderbilt type team, and then some lucky soul will have might have the opportunity to play both Vanderbilt and Duke
Ooh.
in the same year in football. Um, so I just no, I just as much as I like the basketball rivalry, I don't want that.
So who would you propose to your compromise then? If I say you can't have North Carolina State, which in the end I'll probably end up liking North Carolina State more than your compromise pick, but I'm curious who you would go to next if I rejected NC State flat out.
I would go to Miami.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I know the SEC, of course, is already would be pretty well entrenched in Florida with Florida and Florida State, and I know Miami has some shortcomings. Mario Cristobal's last minute coaching for one, but still, it has had a period of glory, not just success, but it had a football dynasty from the early 80s to the early 90s. That was a pretty impressive run under different coaches. Uh, so I think there's more potential there with Miami if Miami were really good in football. But I'm trying to think of somebody else. Pittsburgh is just more of a pro town.
Yeah.
And it's not. Um, no, I having lived there, it's certainly not your typical northeastern city. I really liked Pittsburgh, living there for 1 year, and I guess I would probably go. Maybe a better compromise candidate would be Virginia Tech. To me, it has more. Going back to my what I said earlier, its fan base is more SEC like. I don't know what Miami's fan base is.
What
I
fan
mean,
base?
yeah, I mean, it's we're with you as long as you're unbeaten kind of fan base. And if you're a national player, yeah, we're with you. But no, I guess I would probably Virginia Tech would be my preference. And that gets you in Virginia too, if
Yeah,
that's
I think
important.
of the three you've proposed: NC State, Miami, and Virginia Tech. I think I would like NC State the best. I like the idea of that the best. I would go Virginia Tech too. I really don't love the idea of Miami in the SEC. I think they are three for me. They just don't fit the culture. Miami's south of the South. That's a beach party city. That's not a college football city. That's not a Southern city. It just doesn't to me. The SEC has worked so hard to build a brand, to build a culture in this conference, and I think that would be probably out of sorts for the SEC more so than the other two. So I would take NC State then Virginia Tech before Miami. If I made you choose between Virginia and Duke, uh, my possible throw-ins here, how would you decide that one?
I'd take Virginia
Oh wow, okay.
based on it gets you in a different state and it's all around programming. Um, so I'm not real keen on your Duke idea. I
All right,
think
fair enough.
you're in love with that rivalry, the basketball rivalry, and that's great. Um, Maybe I'd take Duke if Coach K came out of retirement.
That's the condition for them to get admitted to
Yes.
the SEC. Yeah, I don't. I also don't know how SEC fans would accept Duke and all that goes with Duke. Although maybe that makes for better rivalries, but I think that could be hard to sell to some of your SEC fan bases. The idea of Duke being in the conference, the ultimate
Well,
basketball blue blood, the private school, the whole bit.
I think one advantage might be you could see a fan base. Let's go take over Duke Stadium the way they do at Vanderbilt. I think that possibility. If you're looking for fan incentive, that could be it. Oh man, let's go take over their stadium. Let's paint it red and Georgia red and black, or Alabama crimson, or Tennessee orange and white. Yeah.
Yeah, the only downside, none of those Nashville honky tonks would be at your fingertips there. I think that's part of the appeal of taking over Vanderbilt Stadium. These opposing fans, after the game's over, they want
Yeah,
to they want to hit the bar scene in Nashville, listen to some live music, and grab some tall boys and have
Well,
fun.
yeah, let's go tour the medical facility after the
Yeah.
game.
Yeah, that doesn't move the needle. All right, John, let's change gears and get into the College Football Hall of Fame, which was in the headlines this week. A couple coaches grabbing some headlines. The late Mike Leach, column from the Clarion Ledger within our USA Today network, stumping for Mike Leach's candidacy for the Hall of Fame. Right now, Leach is ineligible for the Hall of Fame ballot because there is a rule with the College Football Hall of Fame that you have to have a 60% winning percentage, 600 winning percentage to be eligible for the Hall of Fame ballot. Leach is just barely missing that winning percentage to get on the ballot. Now, of course, he coached and thrived at schools that were not accustomed to great success, from Texas Tech to Washington State to Mississippi State, the final stop in his career before he died in 2022. And there have been a lot of folks pushing to get Leach on the ballot. And as I said, you can find a column this week from the Clarion Ledger stumping for Leach to get on future ballots. That has not changed yet. And the Hall of Fame has not tipped their hand whether they will make an exception and waive that requirement to get Leach on the ballot in the future. And then you have Les Miles. Les Miles is ineligible for the Hall of Fame as it stands, despite the fact that his actual winning percentage was well over the 60% threshold. LSU vacated 37 wins from Miles' career during his LSU tenure due to recruiting violations. And so, with those 37 wins vacated, Miles is ineligible based on the winning percentage requirement, and he's now filed a lawsuit against LSU, arguing, against those vacated wins, preventing him from being considered for the College Football Hall of Fame. So, how do these two candidacies grab you? Do you think Leach and Miles are? I mean, put the requirements aside, the vacated wins for Leach or for Miles, excuse me, and the little rule that the Hall of Fame has about 60% wins. Are these guys Hall of Famers in your book? How do you see their candidacies for the College Football Hall of Fame, Mike Leach and Les Miles?
Yeah, I look at them quite differently, and the point is that a lot of things maybe go into being a Hall of Fame coach. I give Mike Leach a lot of credit for what he did at programs that don't achieve at the highest level. You don't win national championships at Texas Tech, Washington State, and Mississippi State. You can have winning teams. You can go to bowls, and every now and then threaten the elite programs in your conference there, which Mike Leach did in those places. So I, and then just, I don't know. I guess I give him credit for being innovative, for he kind of pushed the game along as it evolved, and he was part of this what we have now, this high scoring, wide open spread offense. He did that, really worked it, and was an extreme example of that. So I give him a lot of credit for that. I think he's a really good coach, and it's hard to ignore personality. He was just such an interesting character and an atypical coach. I think he had a law degree. Um, he was very well rounded, had so many different interests, so many of which have been written about, his interest in pirates and Indians and all kinds of things. Les Miles, conversely, was just kind of a goofball,
Mm-hmm.
and to me, fell into a great situation at LSU. And maybe I'm not giving him enough credit. He did maintain that program for a while, but I think it hurt Les Miles. He won a national championship there, succeeding Nick Saban, who built the program. It hurts Les Miles that Ed Orgeron also won a national championship there. So we look at LSU, well, anybody can win a national championship there. So you can't make that the decisive factor in Hall of Fame induction. So I look at it, I guess It also bothers me, maybe it shouldn't, but it's as though Les Miles is campaigning to be in the Hall of Fame. I I, I don't know. I find that a little repugnant, actually, that he's campaigning. Oh, give me those wins. I deserve those wins. Just because I cheated and they took the wins away, give them back to me so I can be in the Hall of Fame. No, that makes me not want you in the Hall of Fame. Go
Mhm.
eat some more grass and keep your eye on the clock. He couldn't do that as a coach always.
So it's not the cheating that necessarily turns you away from Miles' candidacy. It's his campaigning to get on the ballot and the lawsuit that more turns you away. If it was just the cheating and he was eligible for the ballot, you might consider him. But it's the fact that he really, really wants to be on the ballot so much that he's suing to
Ha.
try to get on the ballot.
Well,
That's kind of what's turning you off.
yeah, I guess it's the combination. Okay, I got caught cheating. Okay, well, you should have cheated better. You should have cheated better. I mean, I'm sure. Do you think every coach in the Hall of Fame ran a pristine program? No NCAA violations? Of course not. Uh, but you know what? When you just think, if you just put a coach's photo up on a board and you're actually asked to respond right away. You put different coaches' pictures up there, and you say Hall of Fame or not. Nick Saban, yeah. Kirby Smart, yeah. Go right down the line. Les Miles, huh? I just I don't think of him as a Hall of Fame coach.
Yeah, I'm not sure I do either. That's the thing. Even if you put these vacated wins back on Miles' resume, he would have won about 67% of his games, about two-thirds of his games throughout the course of his career. That's nice, you know. I mean, he maintained what Nick Saban had cooking there at LSU, won a national championship, had several seasons of double-digit wins, but I don't really care much one way or the other, to be quite frank. But
Yeah,
I think if I was voting for any Hall of Fame, I would probably be one of those voters that was a little bit stingy with my ballot. Now, I'm not saying, these some of these baseball voters make even the all-time best players wait till second or third time on the ballot before they vote for him. I wouldn't do that. I mean, Nick Saban, he's a first ballot Hall of Famer, sure. I'm not saying that type of stuff, but just because you win a national championship, does that automatically make you a Hall of Famer? I mean, that's really the line on Les Miles' resume that would make him a Hall of Famer is he won a national championship at LSU. But to me, winning one national championship does not automatically put you in the Hall of Fame. And it was a bit of an anomaly of a season. They won the national championship that year with two losses. So be that as it may. So yeah, I don't have much argument against either of these guys. With Miles, my leaning would be again, I'm not sure he's a Hall of Famer even with the vacated wins being back on the resume. With Mike Leach, I think he had an incredibly interesting career. Made programs that were relevant while he was there. On the other hand, I'm not one for setting aside rules, just for particular people or creating special circumstances to set aside the rules. I mean, if the rule is you have to have won 60% of your games to get on the Hall of Fame ballot, I could see the Hall of Fame saying, "Hey, we got these rules. We make an exception for one. You may have to make who else do you have to make an exception for?" And although his passing in 2022 was tragic and sudden, does that mean you have to set aside the rules because he died on the job? I don't know. Again, I don't really have a strong argument against Leach being in the Hall of Fame. I'd certainly be fine with it, but just generally speaking, I don't love the idea of setting aside the rules that have been in place for most individuals, setting aside those rules for a special case scenario.
I guess the main problem I have, it's not whether these guys are in or out of the Hall of Fame, it's with the rule itself.
Mhm.
I mean, baseball, to me, baseball Hall of Fame is probably gets more attention than the other Hall of Fame. You don't have to hit so many home runs as a hitter to get into the Baseball Hall of Fame. You don't have to hit for a certain average to make it to Cooperstown. You don't have to have so many strikeouts per inning. I think it's just kind of an unusual rule, and I don't like that, because I think you need to take each case on an individual basis and evaluate that coach. And there's so many things that go into it. You mentioned the biggest plus for Les Miles is winning a national championship. Well, Gene Chizik won a national championship at Auburn and got fired a couple of years later. Uh, you know, Ed Orgeron won a national championship, had a great unbeaten team, one of the greatest teams of all time in college football history. But Ed Orgeron's not a Hall of Fame coach. I don't think anybody would say that. So that's not, shouldn't be the sole determining factor. If that's the only card you can play, I think you need to reshuffle the deck and come up with some better cards. Um, so again, I look at Mike Leach a little differently because of where he coached and what he accomplished there. But yeah, I just don't get the 60% winning. I look at Johnny Majors at Tennessee. He was at Pittsburgh. He was at Iowa State. Johnny Majors won a national championship at Pittsburgh and fielded a tremendous team there. But what Johnny Majors did, and what makes him so significant to me in college football, he went to 3 different programs that were down and built them all up into top 10 programs. Not top 10, I'm sorry, but made them much better than they were. He made Pittsburgh a top 10 program. He made Tennessee a top 10 program. At Iowa State, uh, I think that was one of the most challenging rebuilding jobs ever in college football, because he went there right at the end of the 60s and turned that program around. So that in 1971, Iowa State, I think it was lost 3 regular season games. That's all. The only teams that lost 2 were number 1 Nebraska, number 2 Oklahoma, and number 3 Colorado. So that Iowa State team was pretty good, and he did that. He turned that program around. Pittsburgh was just a horrible situation. He didn't just take it to the top. He created one of those legendary teams that I don't think anybody from any era would have wanted to play against for a championship. And then at Tennessee, he built that up. The Tennessee program, he built it up. And yet, despite all that, he goes back to Pittsburgh in the final phase of his career, is not able to turn it around twice. That was too much to ask. And those losses, just like the losses that LSU deprived Les Miles of for cheating, those losses on the field for Johnny Majors at Pittsburgh put him below the percentage mark, the 600 winning percentage. So, but I look at his body of work and I look at Johnny Majors and I say, more so than Mike Leach, more so than Les Miles, much more so, I say, yeah, he's a Hall of Fame coach. Now, he's in the Hall of Fame as a player, but I really believe he should be in as a coach too.
Well, the more you're talking, John, I mentioned I don't like setting aside the rules for one particular instance or for one particular person. I'm not about that. But I could get behind the idea of there just not having this rule. And that's one thing. We both vote in the Heisman Trophy. And that's one thing I really like about Heisman Trophy voting is there's no ballot. They don't really give you any instructions. You get a little passcode. It's like breaking into Fort Knox. It can be very hard to access your ballot. That's maybe one thing I don't like about voting in the award, but I understand there's security issues, especially in this day and age and what have you. But what I like is there's really no rules. You get to type. I mean, you manually type in the name and school. So you want to spell check and not vote for someone accidentally. I mean, like I said, there's no ballot. You type in the 3 people you want to vote for, and you submit your ballot, and there's your 1, 2, 3. And I like that. You can use whatever barometers, criteria you want. And there's so many voters, I think it all kind of balances out. The outliers get tossed out. And I think most years you have a deserving winner for the most part. You can debate it, but I think there haven't been too many years where you can say this person just completely didn't deserve it. But I like that. There's no, oh, you got to have such and such stat to vote for this person. So, yeah, my thing with Leach should be I'm fine with him being in the Hall of Fame. I'm impressed by what he did at 3 schools. Those Texas Tech teams in particular, man, I loved watching those teams. The Big 12 was so much fun during that
Yeah.
time, and they were sort of the tip of the spear in some ways of making the conference fun to watch. So, yeah, I would consider him if I was a Hall of Fame voter and there wasn't this rule. I just don't like putting the rules aside for special circumstances. So to heck with the rule. If you don't like the rule anymore, just get rid of it all entirely. I just don't just put the rule aside for Mike Leach. Put it aside for everybody, because to your point, there are other deserving candidates, or at least candidates that some voters might wish they could vote for, like Johnny Majors, and let the chips fall where they may. See if they get enough votes to get in.
Yeah, I agree. And I never really thought about the Heisman that way. And the reason you say you like it, because there is no set criteria. And when you have that many voters, you're going to have some nut jobs voting, let's face it. But there will be enough votes overall that won't win the day. But I do like nobody. You sit down to vote, and it's on you. You weigh things, and I know you take it seriously. I do too, and I weigh a lot of different things. And it's not just stats. Um, it's not just how many games your team won. You certainly can take that all into account, but at the end of the day, you're just making a decision based on who you think is the very best player. And is he most valuable, or is he most talented? However you want to do it. So I do like that. I wonder if the winning percentages, if you do that, I wonder if that was set up because they didn't want it to be a popularity contest, whereas some coach is just extremely popular. I think Mike Leach, aside from his successful coaching, was well liked by the average college football fan because he was different, because of what he might say, and his approach was so in some ways non-football like. So yeah, there have been really popular coaches through the years that didn't win a lot of games, but maybe I don't know if that was a factor in it or not. But to me, it's too much of a hard and fast rule because there's some variables in there that need to be considered.
All right. Well, you can't vote for John or I for the College Football Hall of Fame, unfortunately, but you can vote for liking our podcast. We would appreciate it if you'd take a moment, if you like what you hear, to go ahead and give us that rating, subscribe, give us a review. Those ratings and reviews help us find more listeners. And we're going to leave that debate here for now. We got some more fun topics in store for you throughout the preseason. We hope you check us out again soon. Thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.